Hey, it's Professor Gould again, and in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about this powerful molecule called ATP. It's a really important thing that cells use to do a lot of work. It is the most common molecule used to power processes inside a cell. So an ATP molecule has four parts. Actually, ATP means adenosine triphosphate. So the adenosine is actually a nucleotide. It's the A, ACGT in DNA. It's the A. And it looks like this. So it's got a sugar and a little base part. And then in ATP, it is bound to three of these things, which is a phosphate or phosphate group. Phosphate by itself is a really common functional group. And in ATP, we're actually going to put three of these, hence the triphosphate. We're going to put three phosphates, connect them to an adenosine, and we get this molecule here. So here's the adenosine part. Here's the 1-phosphate, 2-phosphate, 3-phosphate. And then the way that the cell is going to use this for energy is that it's going to break this bond here between phosphate number 2 and phosphate number 3. And the resulting molecule is really cleverly named adenosine diphosphate, because di means 2, get it? So we went from triphosphate 3 to diphosphate 2. I know, how cool is that, right? Like totally. Okay, I thought it was cool. Anyway, and that looks like this. So here's our ATP with our high energy bond here. You do not need to know the word phosphoanhydride. And then this phosphate gets taken off. This bond is broken. A little bit of energy is released. It's not a lot. If you're thinking that just does not seem like very much, it's not, but we're not doing big things inside a cell. So we don't need a ton. And then that phosphate group is going to get transferred to another molecule. Okay, it's never just hanging out in the cell all by itself. All right, it's always chaperoned, if you want to think of it that way. So anyway, it's going to get transferred to something else. Okay, depends on what we're doing. Then we have ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups. Now, in order to make ATP again, we're going to put that third phosphate back on here and make ATP. And guess where that happens? In the mitochondria, which is called the powerhouse of the cell because it makes a molecule that is power for the cell. That's why it's called the powerhouse of the cell. I thought it was cool. So anyway, this is happening constantly in all of your cells. ATP is getting is broken up into ADP and a phosphate group. Energy is used to do something in the cell, and then cellular respiration is going to harvest the energy within the bonds of a glucose molecule to attach phosphate back onto the ADP to make ATP again. Actually, it's not 1-to-1. One glucose gives you like 36 ATP. It's really complicated. We'll talk more about that later. Now, here's another way to look at it. You don't need to know how to draw these molecules. Okay, this is fine for me. A adenosine and 3 phosphate groups. Okay, if I ask you to draw it, that's all I'm asking of you. So we have ATP, 3 phosphates, break this bond, release energy, we get ADP plus a phosphate. Now, what can we do with this? All kinds of things. So every time you move muscles, your muscle, the proteins inside your muscle cells have to use an ATP to break the bond, it's really weird, between one part of the one muscle protein and another muscle protein. And the power of the ATP is going to then flex this little neck when the junction is made and contract the muscle. So every time you move a muscle, you are using millions of ATP molecules to enable that contraction to happen. One other way that we're going to use ATP in the cell is to open up channels or to move something up a concentration gradient. So you remember when you learned about the sodium-potassium pump. and ATP was used to provide the energy to move the sodium and the potassium, both moving up a concentration gradient. So that's what we're showing here. Here's a transport protein. We're binding a phosphate to the protein. That changes the shape of the protein, provides energy to move a solute up a concentration gradient. Another way that we use ATP is to provide energy to make other molecules. So we have two reactants here, X and Y. We're going to bind a phosphate to one and then break that away to provide the energy to join these two to create a new chemical bond, and then that produces ATP. So every time that we make proteins, every time that a ribosome is making a protein, every single time it needs to make a peptide bond, it uses an ATP to do that. So ATP is really, really common in the cell and very, very powerful. Okay, next we're going to talk about another group of molecules that we use that are called enzymes. And enzymes are going to be another really important part of the cell. It's going to use energy and free up some energy.